All right, guys, we're moving on now to one of the most important modules inside of Ozone and Ozone 7, and it's called Dynamics. So there is some crossover with what the Dynamics module does with some of the other modules. For instance, this is at its core a mixture or a combination of compression, limiting, and expansion. You'll notice though, if you click on the Insert Module tab here, we've already we've already seen that there's these different modules. We have a vintage compressor, and we have a vintage limiter, and the dynamic EQ can either act as it's basically a multi-band compressor, but it's more kind of laid out like a multi-band EQ that has compression. So there is some crossover with this, but the dynamics tends to work a little bit differently with in terms of how it actually affects the sound. And it's one of the most important elements of Ozone and Ozone 7. This thing can actually add punch, clarity, depth. It can do a bunch of different things to your mix and ultimately your master. So it's a mix of 4 different bands here across the top. And the really cool thing is you can freely change where those bands exist. Now, doing an overarching kind of where you'd put this band would just be stupid, or where you'd put each of the 4 bands potentially, because that's dependent on 2 things: your genre and then your mix in that genre. For instance, in a hip hop 808 heavy song where maybe the 808 is 60 to 70% of the mix, think like an OVO or Drake style track, it would be, you'd have this a little bit higher than you would normally because you want some of those higher frequencies of the sub to be maybe compressed or expanded and bigger. Now with a singer-songwriter type track, maybe there's not a lot of low end. You might move this lower and then have more presence in the low mids. So it really just depends. There's no right or wrong with that. That is something that you will have to get used to playing around with. There's I wouldn't say just stick with a preset with where these things are, where the different bands exist, because you don't want to just go off of a preset, because again, genre difference, arrangement, instrumentation, and then also how you mixed it and how you want your mix to be. All right, so if we load up any preset, literally almost any preset in Ozone 7, you'll notice that I'll just arrow through these. First 2, equalizer, dynamics. You're going to pretty much see the dynamics on almost every one of them. This one's just enhanced stereo image, so it makes sense that's not there. Gentle, exciting makes sense, but anything that's actually like a mastering preset, you'll see that the dynamics are pretty much always on. And it's, like I said, it's one of the more important functions inside of Ozone. I can't stress that enough. So let's recall the default here. All right, so we're going to take off the equalizer, take off the maximizer. So we just have the dynamics pulled up. Now, I already kind of touched on this. You have these 4 different bands up here, and at the very top are the frequencies. There's 20, 100, and then there's the actual indicator that's in white telling you where you're at. So it's kind of nice because you kind of know, okay, here's 20, here's 100, 200, 500, 1K, etc., all the way up to 20K, and then whatever you're moving around in that band displays in white. Now, they're all color-coded. So right now, if you look down here at these other controls, which we're going to touch on in depth in a minute, you'll see that's all purple right now. Well, if I click into the middle of this next band, you'll see that everything's blue, and this line is blue. This line still here is purple. So if we click on this one, you would assume that these will be yellow. And they are, and then this one's red. Now, up here in each band, in each of the 4 bands, you have a power button and a solo button. Now, the power button's kind of nice. You don't have to have all 4 on. That really does depend on your genre and your mix. So if you want to take away a band, you can just hit the minus, and now it's 1 band. And you can hit plus again all the way up to 4, and it will give you the 4 different bands. So you can solo each band, which is really nice. Let's actually listen to the low end of this track. All right, so I just compressed the heck out of it. Let's listen to that. It's going to sound weird, but...
Looking in the mirror, who I see.
So maybe, let's say there wasn't a lot of low end in this track, but let's say you had a track that has a bunch of low end. You can remove some of it with this compression setting that we just kind of messed around with.
Living free. 1,000 mistakes spelling.
So yeah, it's really nice that you can actually isolate individual bands. So let's actually reset some of this. All right, let's listen to the mid band now.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. 1,000 mistakes spelling out the truth. Truth is that I got nothing left to lose. Climbing in mountains and I love this view.
All right, so I was kind of adjusting it as I went, kind of finding where the crossover frequencies are. So let's listen to both these now with the low soloed and the low mid.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free.
All right, let's listen to the high, the high mids.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. 1,000 mistakes.
All right, so I just messed around in the wrong band, so this is a good time to touch on undo last function. All right, so let's click on the yellow one. All right, so this is going to bring up her vocal. So let's say I wanted to bring out the vocal a little bit.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. 1,000 mistakes spelling out the truth. Truth is that I got nothing left to lose. Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living.
All right, so here's with what I just did on
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off.
and off.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free.
All right, let's try that again.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and.
So you can see that what I've just started to play around with it. I know I haven't touched on all the controls, but that's kind of what you're kind of finding different sections of your mix that you may want to either accentuate or reduce. You can either clean up or add to. So remember we've talked about that mastering mindset, kind of that list of listen to your song, make the pros and cons. And if it's a pro, maybe say, okay, I really like how that snare hits or how her voice is kind of middle glossy, it's not too shiny. Maybe you can find a way to accentuate that pro. Or you can always go and say, okay, there's not enough bass, there's too much bass, find a con, and you can actually address it through this dynamics module. But you should at least understand now this top part. This is just different sections of the frequency spectrum and what part of your mix then that you're affecting down here with the limiter and the compressor and all the subsequent controls. So now we kind of got our feet wet into it. Let's actually talk about this in some depth now. Some of the key features of this is that it is basically, like I said a few minutes ago, it's a dynamic processor with 4 different bands where you can really dial in specific frequency ranges, and you can actually do mid-side, which is really cool. So we were just messing around with it in stereo, but we could actually just listen to the mid and the side and then compress either the side or the mid as we need, and we'll look at that in a few minutes. All right, so let's actually talk about some of these different controls that you get for each band, and they are the exact same for each of the 3 bands. And don't worry, we'll talk about if you're wondering why I haven't touched on the view modes, we'll talk about that later. I want you to have a better understanding about what's going on here than the different view modes because, like I said, this is one of the most important parts of Ozone 7. All right, so this section down here is basically broken up into 3 different sections. That's how I like to look at it. You have the limiter, or the limiting, the compression, and then you have the expansion. All right, so what this allows you to do is it allows you to do really anything you want to the mix. Let's say you have parts of the mix that are too high and too loud. Maybe the kick or the snare is way too much of the mix. Well, if we stay in this mastering mindset where we've done our best with the mix and we don't want to keep going back and forth, and you want to stay in the mastering mindset and use the tool of Ozone 7 to get the job done, what you can do is you can tame and limit those high-level signals, the louder signals, with the limiter. And then maybe you can, if there's part of the mix that didn't shine through enough, maybe it's the vocal, you can add some compression to give the perceived boost or bump in presence or volume. And then you can even expand certain parts of the frequency spectrum if they maybe you're like, dang, I wish there's more high-end shine in this mix, or it needs to be for this genre. You can do that. So that's kind of how this is functioning and this is working. This combo can really do a bunch of things. It can either tighten your whole mix, it can make it pump, it can actually just change the whole sonic kind of timbre and vibe, which is really cool. All right, so we've already talked about the band display here, but let's actually go to over here where it says band 1. You can actually arrow through. So there's a few ways you can just click if you want on here, or you can just click on band 1, band 2, band 3. You can also click on all, and then what this will do is it'll change your whole appearance for all of the bands. So if you like kind of seeing what's going on
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the
all at once, that's really helpful. It's basically a mixer of the limiter and the compressor and the expander and everything, so you can actually see how much compression, how much limiting you're adding to your mix, and how much gain.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free.
And you'll notice here that you have controls like ratio and attack, right? Well, it starts out, the limiter starts out by default, I believe. Let's actually load up the default one. Let me actually see, because I would assume it would start at 10 to 1. Let's see. Yeah, so it starts at 10 to 0 to 1 for all of them, and that's because it's set, the limiter is set to, it's a limiter. If you didn't know, limiting is nothing but compression, just really intense compression. So it's basically the lowest amount of limiting you can do in a ratio sense would be 10 to 1. So if I actually loaded up a compressor and set the compressor to, let's say, a vintage compressor, and I set the ratio to 10 over 1, we're actually in the limiting world. So so that's very light limiting. So you'll notice that it's by default, it's on pretty light settings. You have attack, release, and you can see all this at once. I want to point out before we get back into the other controls that when you're on this all, it's really helpful to see. This is my favorite view once I get it dialed in, but let's load up a preset. And you'll notice that focus dynamics, let's look at this, and we go to all. You'll notice that there's not a huge amount of reduction. The red is indicating how much of a reduction in that part of the frequency spectrum you get. So if I turn this up a lot, the limiter.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me.
These controls are unlike when we talked about in the previous videos some of the vintage EQ. I said how musical they are. It's a very musical sounding EQ. This isn't musical. If you touch this and mess with the compression setting and the limiter setting too much, so you see the compression's right here, the limiter is up here, so it's a blend between the two. You're gonna really squash your mix and ruin it.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I.
So let's say we just talked about how there's these 3 different modules in the dynamic module itself. There's these 3 different processes. There's limiting, compression, and expansion. So let's say you wanted to, when I talked about how if there's part of the mix that isn't popping out of the mix enough, let's say it's the vocals, you could add compression to that. So the vocals would be over here mainly.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me.
So the vocals are going to be in all 3 of these bands. So let's try to isolate as much of her voice as we can.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Looking in the mirror.
All right, so it's going to be all 3 of those. So we're going to go to the all now, and I'm going to apply some compression to, we'll keep that how it was. I'm going to apply a little bit of compression.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. 1,000 mistakes spelling out the truth. Truth is that I got nothing left to lose.
All right, so let's bump that gain up for those a little bit. We'll do 1 and 2, and we'll just try 1 and 2 for now.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. 1,000 mistakes spelling out the truth.
All right, so now I'm affecting the ratio of the compressor. So we're going to talk about all this in depth, but I just want you to see how this kind of works because there's a lot to talk about, and I don't want it just to turn into a video manual. So I'm messing around with the compression in these 2 different bands that her voice is primarily living in.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off.
And let's turn the limiter down just a little bit. I don't want to limit the sound. I want to compress to make it louder.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. 1,000 mistakes spelling out the truth. Truth is that I got nothing. Climbing mountains and I love this view. I've walked through the fire.
All right, so let's say the vocals were too loud. Well, then what you'd do is you would limit that band.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free.
But again, you can hear if I do too much of anything, it's going to lose the musicality because it's affecting the whole song. So you really have to be careful of a couple things. You have to locate what you're trying to do and then just lightly play around with this. You don't want to do too much. So let's load up another preset. We'll do Gentle Dynamics. We'll go to all. This is just basically, it looks like a 3-band one. Oh, no, it is 4. Okay. So yeah, this all section is huge because this is where you can actually see everything happening at once. It's basically your mixer for this module.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me.
So you can see that there's a good amount of compression happening in this, and this preset is called Gentle Dynamics. So you can see here that the ratio is 2:1, so it's not a huge ratio. By default, the compression is set at -12. So it has a good amount of compression.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me.
Again, the limiter not really doing anything.
Looking in the mirror.
So let's load up a preset that implies limiting. Let's try this.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see.
All right, basically anything that has pop is going to be limited. So there's a little bit of limiting.
Looking in the mirror. Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living.
So there's a 1-band 1. So yeah, playing with some of these are really cool. Let's go back to detailed mid-range.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and
I actually like that one. It really boosts the bass. Take the maximizer off.
looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off.
All right, you can see that the gain is quite high for that low end, so let's turn that down by 2 decibels.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask.
All right, so there's that all view. Again, you can go through the bands by this little arrow over here that indicate band 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it changes color, or you can just click in here. But I like working, once you got your settings kind of set for each band and mess around with it, I actually like working with the all, because everything's there. You have pretty much everything there. It's just, it's more of if you're more of a list view person like I am, it's all right there for you. All right, so you can link them, and it'll link all of the controls together. Right, so say you wanted to do everything equally, or maybe you only have 2 bands, that's how you could do it. Now moving under here, you have this slider. This is just your gain right here, and this will just turn up the gain of the whole module. So all 4 bands, all 2 bands, all 3 bands, totally depends on what you have set.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and
But by default, it'll usually be set at 0 decibels. All right, now over here you have a couple interesting things. You have an adaptive release and an auto. Now the adaptive release is, well, it's going to automatically adjust the release time of the compressor based on the peak factor of that signal. So it's Ozone's going to try to detect the transient of the signal, and the release time is scaled to be kind of shorter for less of a pumping effect.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living.
So with any type of adaptive release in any type of compressor or limiter, what's going to happen is if a really sharp transient is detected, it's going to give the release time a little bit shorter of a feeling. So it's reducing the pumping effect that sometimes sound unnatural, especially in the mastering world. And if there's more of like a sustained legato held out section of a transient or a note, it's going to be a little bit longer, so it has less distortion. And that's pretty much just how limiting and compression works. So that's kind of cool. And then under that, you have the auto, which is going to be auto gain compensation, which is something you may have heard about in compressors. So what the automatic gain is going to do is it's going to calculate the RMS. You've heard me talk about this in tutorials and videos before. It's the root mean square levels of both the input and output signals of the compressor. And then it kind of has that crossover section for each band, because right here there is crossovers of each band. So the auto one I usually like having on.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free.
So it's basically kind of a steroided out or a roided out makeup gain control that you'd find in some compressors, and I usually like having it on. It also makes it really easy to A/B everything, because it's bringing up that gain to a more to a closer level of what you have before you've done the processing in the Dynamics module.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the
All right, so let's go back to one of the individual bands. We'll go to the first one. All right, so we're going to look at the limiter, threshold, compressor section of the Dynamics module. And like I said before, it's the same for every band, so we'll just be in the first band. Now, before we talk about what this actually does, I need to talk about these three little controls down here. These are three different detection modes. We have peak, envelope, and RMS. This is going to tell Ozone how to limit or how to compress that frequency band based off of how it's detecting the audio and the transients. So peak, this is it's usually the default one inside the Dynamics module, and when this option is selected, and it will be illuminated in bright blue when it is, the detection circuit, as Ozone Manual calls it, is going to look at any of the peak levels. So it's going to look at, I've talked about this before in some other videos. If I look at like a metering plugin like Logic's Basic Metering, you can see that right now, if I talk louder, there's two different colors. There's blue, dark blue, and this lighter blue. The dark blue is my peak, right? It's measuring how loud the audio peaks at. And that other one is the root mean square. So basically, Ozone's dynamic module has that detection setting for its threshold and for the limiting and the compressor. So RMS is an interesting one. This is going to tell Ozone to look for the root mean square. This is kind of like the overall average of the sound. So for different frequency bands, it kind of makes sense to use different detection levels or modes depending on what genre you're in. For something that was, let's say it's like a EDM track, 4 on the floor, and your low end's all coming from your sub bass. Maybe it's a main room track. It would make more sense to have it on peak versus RMS. But if it's just a pop track like this, I would play around with RMS on the low end as opposed to root means, or as opposed to peak.
looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living.
All right, so there's a little bit of a noticeable difference, but it's not huge, mainly because I don't have drastic settings kind of dialed in here in the compressor and the limiter. All right, then envelope. Envelope mode is kind of like a RMS mode, but a little bit different, but it's going to produce a even level across all frequencies. So that's kind of an interesting one as well to play around with. So by all frequencies, it means this crossover section. So all frequencies within the band and the crossover.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and
I believe RMS can cause a little bit of aliasing, artifacting, if you have extreme settings. So envelope, if you're wanting to go for an RMS, I would just use envelope or as opposed to RMS. It's more of an advanced version of RMS, and it sounds a little bit more musical to my ear. So usually I have it set to peak or envelope. All right, moving on now, you have, I'm going to talk about these different controls here. So this top one is the limiter, and it's set in decibels. And in the limiter over here, you have things like ratio, attack, release, and knee. Now that's all basic stuff. If you're watching a video on mastering, I'm assuming you understand ratio, attack, and release. So that is how you set your limiter.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chain. Nothing left to lose. Climbing mountains and I love.
So I would say for you're not going to do too many extreme settings. If you're using a ratio of 30-to-1 on the limiter, that's a lot of gain reduction. And something would be typically wrong with the mix. I would say I usually have never seen it higher than about 15 personally, but you probably could get away with higher times depending on your attack and release settings. Now under that you have the compressor. So the compressor, this is just all one giant kind of a volume fader here. The compressor, you can see, moves your actual compression settings over here. And the compressor settings themselves are over here. So you can start at a negative ratio value.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Broke lose.
So I actually like using, if I'm just trying to get a little bump in that frequency spectrum or just to make it a little bit more present, I actually use pretty low times. But it really depends on the mix and the genre, or low ratios. But it really does depend on the mix and the genre for sure. And I guess it also kind of plays off of how much you want to limit and how much you want to compress.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free.
All right, so that's all pretty basic stuff, right? I mean, like I said, if you're using any type of limiter or compressor, these are controls you'll find on every type of limiter and compressor. Last thing I wanted to really talk about over here in the dynamics module is this parallel, because this is super cool. This is going to blend. It's basically allows you to do parallel New York style compression by frequency band specific sections of the mix, which is really cool. So you can see a little hotkey says it blends the process signal of the current band with the original signal. So right now it's all wet. So if I wanted to do kind of more of a parallel, like 50-50, we can do this. So let's do a drastic reduction here. All right, so here it is at wet, right? You can barely hear it. And let's do 50%, 60% dry, some wet. So if you wanted to mess around with extreme settings, it's kind of cool because remember, you use in a mix, you'll use parallel compression or New York style compression, whatever you want to call it, parallel processing to thicken things. So this is a great way to thicken your mix.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. 1,000 mistakes spelled.
And then this section over here will visually, this is basically your knee right here. These two little dots is your knee. And then you can actually just turn the compressor settings in decibels down and up if you're more of a visual person. But it's pretty straightforward once you understand what this does. It's fun to play around with. And I would just caution you not to do too many extreme settings with this. And if you're finding yourself having to do that, it may be kind of a issue with the mix itself. And there shouldn't be a huge amount of compression, huge amount of limiting going on in your mix if you're coming from a good mix. All right, so last couple things we got to talk about are the different little views here. This first one is the gain reduction trace. It's a visual cue to see how much gain's actually being reduced. It'll be playing. It's helpful to actually solo a band and then see what's going on with the actual band. So there's very little gain reduction going on right now in this band, and you can see that visually here. I don't use it a whole lot just because I can see that when I go to the All tab, and I can actually see it in the individual band. Then next you have this one's an interesting one. It says detection filter. So the detection filter view is going to allow you to see what's going on with Ozone behind the scene with how it's detecting the audio. And remember, we talked about the detection filters with peak, envelope, and RMS. And you actually have some different controls. You can do some high passing to that filter or to that, which is helpful for crossover frequencies. You can do tilt, which is an interesting one. The tilt is similar to the circuit found on the API compressors, I believe. So it's going to preserve low frequencies quite nicely. And it's kind of, you can kind of see this weighted curve. So this is a cool way to shape individual modules based on how your detection circuit may be affecting the audio. So it's something definitely to play around with. All right, guys, that sums up the kind of look at the Dynamics module. I'll see you in the next section of the tutorial course.